Often, a wrestler will come along who has a lot of hype for one reason or another, but then, once they hit the ring, that hype dies out. When it becomes apparent things aren't working out for them. Of course, the reasons for this can vary, with those reasons ranging from poor quality of work to just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the same result always applies, and this is that they end up being a bust. Who are the biggest examples of this phenomenon? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Gable Steveson. Now, on the face of things, Gable Steveson was destined to be a huge star inside of the squared circle. After all, he was a legitimate gold medalist in wrestling at the 2020 Olympics. And if we know one thing about wrestling, it's that Olympic gold medalists who later segued into the world of the pros have had a very good history. We're looking at you, Kurt Angle. So, when the Indiana native signed a contract with WWE later in 2020, then as part of their NIL program, expectations were high for his future. Would he turn out to be another phenomenon just like Kurt had been decades before? Well, no, unfortunately, and the reason for that was because Kurt Angle was very much a one-of-a-kind performer. So rather than make a quick move over to the main roster where he could wow fans with his skills, Gable Steveson would be drafted to Raw in 2021, and then from there would spend the next 2 years doing absolutely nothing, not even having one single match. What was the reason for this? Well, as would later come out, the young stud just wasn't taking to the ring the way WWE officials had hoped he might, and this led to him being kept off TV as he continued to train. Sure, he was also continuing his amateur career at that point, so clearly that ain't into his schedule too. But even if we take that into account, the apparent lack of progress was a cause for concerns within the halls of WWE. So when it came time to finally have him appear in the ring in 2023, then the WWE chose to not do this on the main roster where the most eyeballs would be watching. Rather, they'd have Steveson on the developmental brand of NXT instead. But even that wasn't enough to dull the disappointment for many fans when they saw the Olympic star step into the ring to face Baron Corbin at that July's Great American Bash show. And it wasn't just TV audiences who noticed this either. No, the live crowd would also be quick to show their feelings on the newcomer, with them raining down chants of "You're not Angle" on him at one point. How would WWE respond to this? Well, apparently agreeing with the crowd, they'd remove Steveson from TV immediately after the match was over. And after some consideration, they'd eventually cut him from his contract altogether. Sure, this might have seemed like a bit of a hasty move, as there was still the chance Gable could have improved as time went on, but when you also take into account the personal troubles he was having at the time away from the ring, combined with his desire to return to the world of the amateurs, it feels like the best decision was made for all parties in the long run. And Gable Steveson isn't the only outside athlete who came into WWE with a big head of steam around the turn of the decade, then proceeded to sputter out spectacularly. No, the same exact thing could be said about our next subject, Cain Velasquez. Of course, when we say the name Cain Velasquez, you probably don't think about his ill-fated run as a pro wrestler first. No, you almost certainly think about his time as a star of the MMA world, as it was there that, while under contract to UFC, he became a two-time heavyweight champion and the man to beat names such as Junior Dos Santos and Brock Lesnar. Needless to say then, this made him quite the star in the octagon, but that clearly wasn't all the California native had planned for himself in terms of his career. What else did he want to do on top of this? Well, wrestle, as it happened. Yes, ever since he'd been a child, Cain was a fan of pro wrestling, with him growing up loving the soap opera spectacle it created. And so that was why, even if he had made his name on being a shoot fighter by then, in 2019 he jumped at the chance to enter the squared circle for the first time by wrestling a trios match with Cody Rhodes and Psycho Clown in AAA. Obviously then, it was only going to be a short journey from there to WWE, especially as Velasquez already had a tailor-made opponent in the WWE in 2019. And so that was why later that same year he'd officially be brought up to WWE too, and promoted as the next opponent to Brock Lesnar. That's right, this was the one that was billed as the rematch of the century, with it seeing the Beast try to avenge his loss to Cain from years before inside of the octagon, this time inside of a wrestling ring instead. And that led to the match between Lesnar and Velasquez at October 31st, 2019's Crown Jewel, mimicking a showdown in the octagon, and not in a good way either. No, rather than being an exciting battle in the style of a WWE match, this contest only put fans to sleep as it mimicked an MMA fight in a worked environment and had none of the spectacle of a pro wrestling encounter. So bad was it, in fact, that once it was over, Cain Velasquez would never be seen inside of a WWE ring again, but he's not the only one whose WWE run came to a sudden end. No, the same could be said about our next subject, someone who goes by the name of the Velvetine Dream. Of course, the situation didn't always have to be this way for the Velvetine Dream. No, early on in his WWE run, he looked like he was pegged to be one of the company's next major stars. Hell, despite being an alumni of Tough Enough, he'd find himself getting over in a huge way with hardcore fans during the mid to late 2010s. Why was this? Well, because it was here that the character of the Dream was first created, with it being an ambiguous Prince-inspired figure who took everything Goldust had been doing back during the 90s and updated it for a modern day. Needless to say then, all of this led to much success for Patrick Clark, the man behind the gimmick, with him becoming North American champion before the decade was out. So what happened to cause him to flame out so spectacularly following that? Well, two things, the first of which were rumors that he was too much of a diva backstage and was prone to causing problems. Now, you can be a backstage headache in wrestling and keep a job, you just have to be a big enough star to warrant people putting up with you. Shawn Michaels in the 90s is a good example of this. Unfortunately for the Velveteen Dream though, while he was an apparent star in waiting back at the turn of the decade, he wasn't a big enough deal for everyone to look the other way with regards to his attitude problems. And then of course there were the personal troubles he got into behind the scenes too. So it was then that WWE cut him from his contract in May of 2021. What would we do after this? Not a great deal. And this had continued to be the case right up until the present day, with him all but only being active in smaller indie promotions. Still, while this is a bitter pill to swallow for him, at least Patrick Clark isn't the only person from the black and gold NXT roster who looked like he was going to be a big deal in WWE, but who ended up being a bust instead, as we could say the same thing about our next subject, Lars Sullivan. Yes, back in the mid-2010s, Lars had something WWE were looking for in a top heel, and that he was a big guy with a great look. Really, given some of the people who Vince McMahon had pushed to the moon prior to this, it should have been a home run for Lars to make it all the way to the top. And that's why once he joined the NXT roster in 2017, it felt like he was on the fast track towards the main roster, with this proving to be true as just 1 year later when, after taking on the likes of Johnny Gargano and Aleister Black down on the developmental brand, he'd be called up to Raw in early 2019. So what went wrong at this point then? Well, it appears the problem lay with the Colorado native's mental health issues. That's right, after appearing at the building for Raw on January 14th of that year, he'd have a panic attack and be able to go out in front of the live crowd. That said, while this may have hurt his stock in the eyes of the boss, at least he would be given a second chance, and that second chance saw him come out to destroy Kurt Angle just a few months later. But again, even with him being pushed hard, those panic attacks would prove to be the big man's undoing, as they'd be a recurring problem for him in the weeks which followed, with these only intensifying after he picked up a knee injury during a 3-on-1 handicap bout against the Lucha House Party, and his confidence was shot as a result. Why was he suffering so much in this respect? Well, part of the reason was because by this point, a lot of his prior history had been revealed to fans, a history which included some message board posts and an appearance in an adult film during his younger days. So because of the content of these message board posts, many fans turned on Lars, and this made it all the harder for him to get his head in the game for long enough to perform. Obviously then, such a thing seriously hampered his momentum, so much so that Vince McMahon had to sit up and take notice. And this meant doom for Sullivan's prospects, as in January of 2021, he was cut from his contract. What would he do after this? Not a great deal. No, as it stands today, he's pretty much retired from the ring, and this puts him in the same category as our next subject, someone who WWE had high hopes for back during the crossover period between the Attitude Era and the Ruthless Aggression Era, but who flopped hard. The one, the only, Nathan Jones. Yes, before Australia gave the wrestling world stars like Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm, one of the exports they were most known for was Nathan Jones. And that's unfortunate because Jones is someone who has went down as a bust in the world of wrestling at this point. But it didn't always look like things were going to be this way. No, early on, there was a lot of hype around the Gold Coast native, and the reason for that was because his prior career as a strongman made him seem like he was tailor-made for WWE. The only problem with this, though, was that being strong wasn't enough to make Jones any good in the ring. No, whenever it came time for him to step inside of the squared circle, his limitations were immediately on display. And that incident must have made WWE officials very nervous, as this was right at the point the big man was being set up to team with The Undertaker in a tag bout against The Big Show and A-Train at WrestleMania 19. So nervous would they get, in fact, by the time WrestleMania rolled around that year, the company would have lost all faith in Nathan's abilities as an in-ring performer. And that was why, realizing they couldn't put him in the ring on their biggest show of the year, they instead pulled him at the last minute and turned the whole thing into a handicap match. Sure, the Australian would make a cameo appearance at the end of this one, but it would be just that, a cameo. And after it was over, his days in WWE would be numbered, with him eventually parting ways with the promotion altogether in December of that year. Could things have been different for Nathan Jones? Maybe. But then sometimes people aren't built to be a wrestler. Fortunately for him, though, he has gone on to have a successful career in the world of acting. Sometimes, though, a person is built to be a great wrestler, but this just isn't the way their story plays out in WWE. And if you need any evidence of that, you only need to look at our next subject, Karma. Now, if you don't remember the name Karma, then you most likely will remember the name Awesome Kong, as that's the one Kia Stevens has gone by for the majority of her career. Hell, it was under this moniker that she became a two-time Knockouts champion in TNA and an OG member of the AEW women's roster. Unfortunately for her, though, while she found varying degrees of success in each of these promotions, the same fate would not await her when she briefly signed with WWE back in late 2010. Why was this? Well, despite being booked like a monster during the first few weeks of her run, someone who absolutely mowed through every other lady she came up against with ease, in May of 2011, the Californian had to abruptly take time away from the ring when she realized she was pregnant. Still, though, this was only a temporary thing, and before long she'd be available to return to her old dominating ways, right? Well, that was the hope. And it's what initially led to her coming back like a complete force of nature when she entered the 2012 Men's Royal Rumble match, and from there proceeded to make an impact by eliminating Unico. Unfortunately, though, for personal reasons behind the scenes, Karma wouldn't remain in WWE for much longer. So because of this, the chances of Awesome Kong replicating the success she'd had elsewhere in WWE were gone. And this meant that for the rest of her in-ring career, she'd return to places like TNA. Yes, it's sad that Kia Stevens never got to reach her full potential in the WWE, as had she been booked differently, there's no end to the level of success she could have achieved. Hell, she could have been the second coming of China. She was certainly imposing enough to fill such a spot, but things were what they were at the time, and this isn't the way the story ultimately played out. Still, at least Awesome Kong can rest easy knowing she's not the only performer who seemed like a surefire thing who ultimately became a bust in WWE. Now, around that same time, the exact same thing would be happening with our next subject as well, someone who, as the son of the $1 Million Man, felt like they couldn't fail. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Ted DiBiase Jr. Seriously, now when your dad is a legendary star of Golden Era WWF, it's hard to imagine you wouldn't become a top star. Unfortunately for Ted DiBiase Jr., though, this simply wasn't the case. What happened then to show that the $1 Million Baby experiment was going to be a bust in WWE? Well, despite being given a big push right out of the gate by being paired up with Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes and The Legacy, DiBiase Jr. just wasn't able to rise to the occasion. Sure, he wasn't terrible in the ring or anything, but for someone in the spot he was in, he just never stood out, and so it was that quickly the young rookie became something of a pin eater for the stable. And once they eventually went their separate ways and both Orton and Rhodes found singles success, he'd find himself lost in the wilderness, throwing various things at the wall in the hopes that something would stick and take him to that next level. But nothing did stick for Ted. It didn't matter if he was reviving his dad's old $1 Million championship, being walked down to the ring by Maurice, or forging the DiBiase posse. The sad reality was that fans just didn't take to him in any significant way. As we're sure you can all guess, then things would not end well for the son of Ted DiBiase. Now, instead of reaching the heights that his former teammate Cody Rhodes later did, he'd find himself saying goodbye to the industry altogether in 2013, with him at this point choosing to move over to a new career in sales. And for another example of someone appearing on the face of things to be a shoo-in for success, but not having it upon closer inspection, you only need to look towards our next subject, Parker Boudreaux. Now, it's easy to take a glance at Parker Boudreaux and think that with his general look and athletic history as a college football player, big things would be in his future within the wrestling industry. After all, there's a reason Paul Heyman once tweeted out that he was the future of WWE. But unfortunately, his prediction would mark one of the rare instances of Heyman being wrong, as since that tweet was sent out in 2021, he's pretty much disappeared off the face of the map. What happened to cause this collapse for the Winter Gardens native? Well, like with Ted DiBiase Jr., he was just someone who didn't have that it factor. That's right, Despite making his debut in December of 2021 amidst a wave of buzz, the man who was at this point given the new name of Harland never managed to make it any kind of meaningful splash. Sure, it didn't help that the Harland gimmick wasn't great, but even if he had been given a better character to work with, it didn't look like he was going to fare much better. Why do we say that? Well, because after being cut from WWE in April of 2022 and from there making his way over to All Elite Wrestling, Parker would flop all over again. And this time he would basically be playing himself. Yes, it's true that his AEW run never saw him get any kind of significant push. Rather, most of Boudreaux's time in Jacksonville was spent being a member of the Trustbusters on either Dark or Rampage. And that's why since leaving AEW in 2024, he's apparently decided that there are better things for him to be doing than being a wrestler, as one appearance at a AAA show aside, we haven't seen a thing from him. And Parker Boudreaux isn't the only former WWE star we don't expect to be seeing anything from in the near future either. No, we could say the exact same thing about our next subject, Odyssey Jones. That's right, as it stands today, it looks like Odyssey Jones may be done with wrestling for good. What went wrong with the Brooklyn native? Well, despite having everything wrestling companies look for in a star, in that he was 6'5", 405 pounds, and appeared to have plenty of charisma, none of it ever really gelled together once he was put on screen. Sure, there were times when it looked like something might be brewing for the big man, such as his early appearances on NXT 2.0 back in 2021, where the former powerlifter got all the way to the finals of that year's NXT Breakout Tournament before losing to Carmelo Hayes. Unfortunately for him, though, any momentum he was building up at this point would be stalled when in January of 2022, during a match with Saurav Gurjar, he'd rupture his tendon, something which put him on the injury shelf for close to a year. Still, this didn't have to be the end for the Floridian. No, plenty of stars had fallen to injury before that and come back even stronger. And it appeared WWE was still hoping that this would be the case for him too, as pretty soon after he returned to the ring in October of 2022, he'd be called up to the main roster and eventually slotted into a role as an honorary member of the New Day. Yes, it seemed like now, with such a prominent spot on Monday night, the world was about to become Odyssey Jones' oyster. Sure, he might not have been massively over with fans, many of whom didn't like the idea of him taking their beloved Big E's spot, but there was plenty of time for them to get used to this and warm to the rookie. That was until there wasn't, and the reason there wasn't was because in September of 2024, the big man would be abruptly removed from TV and cut from his WWE contract when he got into trouble behind the scenes. So just like that, his time in the spotlight would come to a dramatic end. Is there still a chance that Odyssey Jones finds a second life elsewhere in the industry? Well, never say never. Sadly though, the reality is, for the time being at least, we've probably seen the last of the brief New Day member in WWE. And this means he'll go down in history as being a big-time bust, much the same way our next subject will be too, Andy LaVine. Don't remember Andy LaVine? We understand this, as he's not exactly a person many wrestling fans talk about today. And the reason for that is because his run in WWE was so uneventful, it's pretty much been memory hold from existence by now. What was the story with him exactly? Well, back in 2010, not long after he graduated college and underwent a tryout for the Miami Dolphins, LaVine found himself being signed up to a developmental contract with WWE, and from there shipped off down to their developmental brand at the time, Florida Championship Wrestling. Not that the rookie would be in FCW for long, though. No, just a year into his run there, he'd be taken off the roster and placed into the contestant pool for the revived version of Tough Enough, WWE's game show where people were given a chance to earn a contract. And this proved to be a very fruitful move for the Brooksville native because he'd end up going on to win the whole thing, ahead of names like Matt Cross, Ariane Andrew, and Ivelisse Velez. Sadly though, despite being given the personal seal of approval from Stone Cold Steve Austin on the June 6, 2011 episode of Raw in the form of a Stone Cold Stunner, LaVine would never really meet expectations on Monday nights. Was this a result of him being put in a spot he was in no way ready for? That was probably part of the issue, yes, but then there's every chance that even if WWE had waited a while to pull the trigger on the newcomer, it still wouldn't have worked out. And we say this because even after he returned to FCW, he apparently never showed much improvement as time went on, with all that leading to him eventually being cut from his contract in April of 2012. Yes, it's sad that he never went any further, but then not everyone can be a success in the wrestling industry. No, as all the people we've looked at today show, there are destined to be some busts.